Ivan, and a very good morning. Past chairs, chairman, board of directors of the chamber, secretariat, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed an honor and privilege to be here this morning. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for placing digital transformation and the digital economy as an apex session in this esteemed Sri Lanka Economic Summit. I'm also privileged and honored to be partnered by Mr. Bhanuka Harishchandra, 25 years my junior, but what represents the future of digital in Sri Lanka. More about that later. The topic today, the digital economy and shaping a roadmap for Sri Lanka. I'm very humbled, as well as probably underqualified at this point in time to talk about shaping an entire digital economy for a country. It's a learning process, it's a listening process, and it's an adjusting and feedback control loop process to develop a digital economy which is sustainable, which delivers equal returns to all citizens and businesses, and places the country ahead of its regional and global peers. So let's start with talking a little bit about what is the digital economy. We have heard many renditions of this topic. We have talked about digital transformation. We have talked about digital infrastructure. And now we have elevated this topic to the level of an economy. And I think that's the correct positioning. And in fact, this positioning should have been brought about many years ago. Because if you look at the levers that we have as a developing nation, as a nation with talent, but deficit in abundant resources, natural resources, for instance, then the leapfrog opportunity we have and the leapfrog lever we have in our hand is digital. And therefore, it could be and will be a major driver of the national economy. The digital economy obviously is a subset of the national economy. And advanced nations, or digitally advanced nations, typically you see that the digital economy represents anywhere between 30 to 40% of the national economy. Nascent digital economies lie in the 1 to 5% region. And that's where we are at present. But through a tight synergy and alignment and coupling of the economic policy of a country and the digital policy, hand in hand, iteratively growing digital and growing the economic output, we could be looking at a digital uplift of 1 to 2 percentage points on top of normative GDP growth. So that if your normative GDP growth is, say, 3%, you could be looking at 4 to 6% or 4 to 5%, and so on. Now, the opportunity is accentuated in the case of developing economies such as ours, and also in the case of economies where digital exports themselves are at a nascent stage, and there's the opportunity to uplift the digital exports themselves in addition to the general mobilization of the economy. There are 3 tiers of digital economy, and broadly the digital economy is defined as a range of economic activities which use digital outputs, digital methods, data, intelligence, and knowledge as the factors of production. Now, the factors of production may lead to the production of a good or a service. And the readiness or maturity of a digital economy, again, is classified into 3 tiers. The first being the core, pretty much information and communication technology, hardware, software services, ICTs basically, and countries which are limited in the scope of their digital economy to this range are typically also in the nascent category. The next extension or augmentation of the scope of the digital economy is the addition of digital platforms, pure platform businesses, pure digital businesses. Ride hailing, for example, would fall into this category. The widest definition, however, is the digitalized economy, where you have a whole of economy mobilization using technologies such as AI, digital, EX, meaning e-health, e-tourism, everything, and also Industry 4.0. I'm sure many of you would be familiar with Industry 4.0, but Industry 4.0 is a portfolio of technologies ranging from the Internet of Things, sensors, artificial intelligence, cloud, bring that all together into a powerful confederation of digital technologies which deliver outputs. So where does Sri Lanka stand on the scale of a set of digital indices globally? Broadly, Sri Lanka stands in the 3rd to 4th quartile across most indices. And these indices, they measure the quality of a digital economy in terms of digital quality of life, the experience that is delivered to citizens and businesses, and across government, the level of inclusion that the digital technologies deliver, the extent to which the depth of the digital economy encompasses a broad spectrum of economic activity on a whole of economy basis, the level of connectivity and inclusion in that respect, e-government, e-business, and of course, innovation. So broadly, Sri Lanka is in this 3rd to 4th quartile. You can see from the color codes, which are a little faded here. But the interesting example, two extremes, India and Singapore. Now, Singapore, due to its size, has a lot of similarities to Sri Lanka. A constrained island, small population, and an external economy-driven nation. Sri Lanka has many characteristics of this configuration. Likewise, India, being a neighbor and having a very similar socio-economy to Sri Lanka, is another example to look at. Of course, India has billions of people, and the challenges of rolling out a whole of economy digital transformation is far more accentuated in the case of a country like India. So there are many, many indices. You can pick one, you can pick many, but broadly, we should be aspiring to move up in the stack on a portfolio of indices. So our ambition, the absolute targets. Let's look at absolute targets first. The absolute targets committed to by the government of Sri Lanka. In numbers, digital exports to go up from the 1.5 billion or so today to 5 billion. That's the factoid I mentioned at the beginning, that in countries where digital exports themselves offer a leapfrog opportunity, it'll add direct to the bottom line of the GDP. Increasing the workforce to 200,000, the digital workforce, and a digital economy of around $15 billion by 2030, which would represent, if our plans on the broader economy work out, we would be looking at around 12% of the economy. Still out of the nascent stage, but gaining traction towards the mid to high end of the spectrum. And as an underlying target, to bring down average transaction costs in digital to below 1%. But something to remember is that when you talk digital economies are not local economies. Digital economies are regional and global. Therefore, when you enter this game, you are automatically inviting competition globally, at least regional. And therefore, your thinking cannot be an island thinking. And therefore, it is very important, in addition to absolute targets, to also set yourself targets which are relative in nature to make sure that with the evolution of technologies, with the transformation that's going on in the rest of the world, that you will not get left behind. So the ambition here has to be aggressive, and we need to target to get to a 2nd or 3rd quartile, preferably 2nd quartile position across the same basket of indices. One index of particular interest is the CHIPS index, which is relatively new and stands for Connect, Harness, Innovate, Protect, and Sustain. I won't go into explaining what these are, but just to throw these words around, to connect as many people as possible, to harness the power of digital inclusively, to innovate, to protect cybersecurity, etc., and sustain. ensure that the industry is sustainable. Importantly, digital readiness correlates with national competitiveness as well. We all know that, whether it's trade, whether it's interactions of e-commerce, etc. Digital readiness and national competitiveness go hand in hand. Therefore, the importance of not targeting only the absolute, but targeting a relative position. So the government of Sri Lanka has published its high-level digital economy strategy. 5 pillars in the main to grow the digital industry itself: digital exports, innovation and new tech, efficient government services, bridging the digital divide, and of course, proliferating infrastructure, which is required across the digital stack. Add to this the institutional and legal frameworks we would require in order to position this 5-pillar strategy on a fast track in terms of delivering outputs and outcomes. Last but not least, trust. Digital means trust. There has to be a trust framework which is unpenetratable and also is robust to give consumers, businesses, government, and our external partners the same level of trust to deal with Sri Lanka in a digital world. While these 5 pillars would take time, and we need to be patient to build these institutional infrastructures as well as the technology, the execution priorities which are already active and in place span in growing the digital industry towards the absolute targets I mentioned earlier, accelerating the digital economy, for example, through the digital ID and everything which comes around it, leveraging on the payment networks we have in Sri Lanka, which incidentally, from a technology perspective, are up there in terms of comparability with the best in the world, capacity building, digital literacy, etc. Efficient government, better government services, superior experience to citizens and businesses. And of course, driving the digitization of specific industries, agriculture, tourism, and all the priority industries within the economy of Sri Lanka. Very quickly, also placing this in the context of the transformation priorities of the nation. We heard from His Excellency yesterday as well about Clean Sri Lanka and the Nexus. But if you look at the national economic priorities such as revenue, growing revenues, exports, competitiveness, trade and commerce, domestic productivity, as well as export earnings, and the entire economic and industrial engine of the country. Poverty alleviation, which would require a mix of targeted welfare, financial inclusion, employment, the advancement of specific sectors which impact the bottom of the pyramid, like agriculture and other sectors, driving the productivity, and of course, inclusive education of parity quality across the nation. Clean Sri Lanka then focuses on a clean society, a clean environment, and ethics and governance. Now, looking across this spectrum of priorities in terms of national transformation, and I by no means have an exhaustive list here. Digital transformation, which means cashless, presenceless, means remote. You don't need to be present to carry out a transaction. Paperless, transparent, and efficient. So the family of strategies need to work hand in hand as well as be tightly coupled in order to deliver the ultimate outcome of a national transformation. When approaching this challenge, it's obviously a mammoth challenge, but when approaching it, it's important to have some beliefs and some fundamental principles in mind. First, inclusion. Do not leave anybody behind. Because through digital transformation, if you exacerbate the problem of leaving communities behind while a minority of the economy progresses rapidly towards global competitiveness, we will have an exacerbated economic issue in the future. So mobilizing the broader economy, bringing every citizen into economic productivity, and then ensuring that we achieve an economic multiplier purely through inclusion is an important target and precept. Looking for ROI and sustainability. We don't always think of digital products as delivering ROI, but it's important we do so. Because who is going to write the checks for all the digital transformation that we are looking at? They need to represent bankable business models, which you, ladies and gentlemen, will invest in. Bankable business models which would attract FDI. Bankable business models which would bring in a combination of multilateral, bilateral, and commercial investors to drive in parallel the various pillars of the digital economy. In terms of architecture, and here I will be corrected no doubt by Bhanuka and all the techies in the audience, platforming becomes an important architectural precept. Platforming means horizontal as opposed to siloed vertical technology solutions. Platforms are technology solutions which can be shared by many. The next is that these platforms need to be open, not proprietary to one single vendor or one single sector, but open through application programming interfaces or APIs, so that the developer community, multiple businesses, could consume those APIs and build their own solutions or mini solutions on top of it. So the digital ID in Sri Lanka is one such example, where very soon we'll be publishing the sandbox of the digital ID with sample APIs, so that the industries, service providers can experiment with what they would do with a digital ID and the APIs which have been exposed to create solutions, to innovate, and to create a multiplier effect of innovation on top of the basic platforms. We have to move away from the concepts of heavy assets, buy something big, buy a system, invest billions of rupees. We have to move away from that towards a talent-centric, agile, innovation-driven ecosystem. And of course, X first. This X changes by the day, but adopting architectural precepts such as cloud first, AI first, mobile first. These are architectural principles that we need to adopt. Keeping in focus, of course, the realities of the digital world. One is that, as I said earlier, this is a regional and global game. It's not an island game. And the more we constrict ourselves and think with an island mentality on a global landscape connected digitally, we are going to exclude ourselves from the opportunities that are out there in the global economy. Remember also that winner takes it all in the digital world. There are global monopolies today who have been born out of digital, and they continue to be born, except they fall very fast as well. But if you do not have the scale, you need to be conscious that you will be overtaken and eaten up by a bigger player. Those are the rules of the digital jungle. And also we need to keep in mind that the priority globally in the digital space has moved away from cheap, low-cost automation or cheap, low-cost labor, and has moved into the sphere of trust and governance. You will not get work, you will not get offshoring if your security standards and your governance architecture is not up to global standards. I'll just quickly flash through a digital economy blueprint. There's no right answer to this or no right design, but just to give you an idea of the layers of the digital economy that need to be built up. The first is digital infrastructure. I think very familiar to most of us. It is the networks, it is the cloud and storage infrastructures. The next one may not be that familiar in terms of a layer, but it's called digital public infrastructure. Digital goods which are established for the broader good of the public and government. And the key element within this category is the unique digital identity, which is currently one of the priority projects of the government of Sri Lanka. And going hand in hand with the digital identity is the national data exchange. Let me pause here a little bit to explain how these two would work together. Now, when you look at a biometric identity, it might worry some of you that eventually everything about you is known. It's stored somewhere in a computer which can break down, which can be stolen. But in this design, the federation ensures that your data is not in any one single place. The custodians of data would be many. For instance, your birth information might be with the registrar of births, and your driving record would be with the related authority, and so on. But the digital ID is able to federate and collect what is required at a particular instance of time through the National Data Exchange. And an important element of the National Data Exchange would be consent, meaning that if there's any exchange of data through a National Data Exchange, you would be notified and your consent would be requested. So just like you get an OTP today, there would be more advanced consent. You get an OTP for consent for a transaction. You would get an equivalent notification for your consent to share your data. And this process, once it gains momentum and scale, enables data to be leveraged safely to deliver what is required at the time. So that when you're applying for a passport, it's only specific data that would be requested. If you're applying for a loan, it would be something else. And this creates a transaction sphere and a digital economy of data transit. Other elements of the digital public infrastructure include payments, authentication, verifiable credentials, your certificates of various sorts, digital signatures, etc. Next layer, government applications and industry service applications, which together with Industry 4.0 technologies and digital services would represent the core, the engine of a vibrant digital economy. Next comes how do we deal with this set of digital assets? And that would be your mobile app, web portal, kiosks, APIs, again, APIs being exposed. Finally, the consumers, citizens, tourists even, e-citizens, businesses, startups, government organizations. Then comes the wrapper. We need to wrap this on all sides. And one important dimension is inclusion, like I mentioned, trust and governance, policy, legislation, and institutional frameworks, and capacity building and sustainability. So this is a blueprint. And you might agree with me that this is a phenomenal task for any government, any institution, any society to implement. And that is where the collectivism on this journey is essential. There is no way that if the private sector or the public sector or the external sector refuses to play in this new game, that we can achieve the targets that we set ourselves. So the problems to solve go way beyond tech. And it is basically whole of economy change management. And ladies and gentlemen, we in this room, I believe, represent quite a cross-section of private and public sector. And unless we all are prepared to change as individuals, adopt digital technologies, change the way we do things, try ride-hailing instead of waiting for our car, for example, many, many instances of joining this digital economy. If you're not willing to change our mindset and culture of work, the ways of work, if you're not willing to simplify the way we do things, and all of us in the private sector, sorry, I was in the private sector, now I'm not. All of us, whether we are in the private sector or public sector, have to be prepared to simplify first. You digitize a broken, complicated process, you're going to end up with a worse problem. Therefore, simplification, giving priority to service experience, that I can talk of from my previous slide. Number one priority for me as a CEO was service experience. If I get that right, if the team gets that right, a lot of rework, a lot of issues, a lot of noise in the organization goes down. People and agile skills. Gone are the days when a university degree will hold you good for anything more than 2 years. now with AI, with the replacement of even technology work by machines and continuous recycling of your skill profile, you need to be agile. On the right-hand side, we have governance, trust, standards and regulations, laws, policies, institutional frameworks, which I'll come to here. And I'm not going to spend time on this. We can take it in the Q&A. But cybersecurity to the fore, data protection, privacy, digital governance, including the governance of AI, and sovereignty and residence. Some of these concepts are real, and they need to be understood and actioned in context of the bigger picture, the bigger good, or the larger good. But to frame it, you have the legislation, the institutions, both existing as well as proposed. Back to the investment case. I spoke about problems, which are non-tech. But the biggest problem, which is non-tech, is who is going to cut the check. There's a lot of money required. And I firmly believe that if we continue with the current model of government cutting checks, government carrying out tender processes to implement digital projects, we will go nowhere. Because sustainability is not guaranteed, no one is accountable for the ROI, and therefore our target should be to convert this 5-year dividend, which I think at a minimum of $10 billion. Remember that 1 to 2% on top of economic growth? You compound that on a growing economy, add to that the digital exports, which the government is targeting, and I'm sure the ecosystem here would deliver. You add that up, you're talking of $10 to $20 billion of economic value. Surely that $20 billion then translates to business models, which the industry, the private sector, and even the external sector in terms of FDI can consume, can invest in. So bankable propositions in this economic dividend. On the social side, there would be digital empowerment, multi-sectoral inclusion, transparency, and a shrinking carbon footprint, which the development partners of Sri Lanka, together with the public sector, would also invest in. So in combination, the investment model is a priority for us to crack. So it becomes a private-public nexus where both hands need to join together, also with the development sector. And we need to innovate in terms of the modalities for private investment, public-private partnerships, licensing, providing market access in return for investment, etc. And one example I can draw from my previous life is the telco industry in Sri Lanka, which since 1996, more than 25 years before Bhanuka was born, or just about, the government has not cut a single check, has not invested a single dollar in the telco industry. The telco industry has all the characteristics of the reform, which was done in 1996 by some very visionary people, where it is private sector led, there's a business model, there's market access, there's an incentive to keep investing. And also today, the telco industry delivers to the government of Sri Lanka something like 75 billion rupees per year in levies and taxes. Doesn't get anything from the government, gives back 75 billion rupees. Delivers another 30 billion rupees to local contractors and employees. So this model we can be proud of. It was built by an entire ecosystem. People from all walks of life, companies and businesses from all walks of life, including the small corner shop, which is in the distribution value chain, enjoying around 20 billion rupees of flow-through. So Sri Lanka can host sustainable, high-tech industry. And if we translate that to the digital economy, you would be, and we get the models right, the contracting models correct, I believe that the cutting of checks will be done by the partners of the government and not by the government itself. So finally, the Chamber has set itself a very ambitious theme this year, transformative growth. However, The small print is within a tight fiscal space. To generate growth, you need to invest. And what would it take when you also have conflicting priorities? If you look at this very simplified 4-block diagram, there are conflicting priorities at each layer. The citizen wants less taxes. The government wants more taxes. The citizen wants better services. Somebody needs to pay for the technology behind those services. Businesses, likewise, they want superior ease of doing business. Involves investment in the digital economy, and so on and so forth. Many conflicting priorities. So we need to align our objectives, align our capabilities with sound business models and sustainable outcomes. So the question is, can digital be the unlock of this conundrum? I'm confident it will be, but not without the support, collaboration, mindset, ambition, and determination of everyone. So I'll stop there and take your questions together with Bhanuka. Thank you very much.
Hey everyone, how's it going? I was told that I'm allowed to ask relatively controversial questions, which is why I took this gig. Dr. Hans has been kind of appointed to chair and lead the digital revolution that's happening in Sri Lanka now. And as a participant in the digital economy, I think what I'd like to bring is a certain set of questions and views that I have that are primarily driven by experiences that we've had building technology businesses in Sri Lanka, whether it's for Sri Lanka or the outside world. And kind of before we get into the nitty-gritties, I'd love to kind of understand a certain set of first principles, because I think realistically the likelihood of success on any of these efforts will be not dependent to leadership, policy, and strategy. It will be dependent to the stakeholders that are on the receiving end, either willing to take that change or not. I see this as a change management exercise of massive proportions. And I'd like to pick on some of the conundrums that I saw on the presentation itself as a point to start with, where you have been given the responsibility to balance two interesting juxtapositions. One is that the digital economy usually is a winner-take-all. Businesses, entrepreneurs start to enter these markets because it has the ability to scale, because you can capture large amounts of market share very quickly. And it's in the exact opposite view of what you mentioned of inclusion, where you have to, as a government, protect the interests of the many. How do you incentivize businesses to go digital in order to kind of achieve their aims of market dominance and monopolization, which is, invariably every business's dream, versus the inclusion factor where you need to support everyone?
I think excellent question, and it's a conundrum. From my own experience, this conundrum can be broken. The chicken and egg can be broken if the right mix of incentives and the right market conditions, market access conditions, as well as resource availability is put in place. So it's important that the proposition to a business which is serving the domestic market, the proposition is one which makes it viable for the business to provide a particular service and succeed and deliver a return above the weighted average cost of capital. I'll not take my previous life as an example, that's a clear example, but let's look at e-channeling. The first digital startup launched somewhere in, I think, before 2010. It was about 2008, I think. So e-channeling solved a problem. So what is very important is to frame problems to solve, however small they are, and offer them up as business models which bridge that problem and deliver economic return to the company or person who is solving the problem. So e-channeling was one where they solved the problem. The consumer was willing to pay, and we all happily pay even now, for solving that problem. And it creates a business model which is sustainable. Now there are two players. Market has expanded, but both are okay. And therefore, I think it's about crafting these business propositions. And that may be the task of the digital services regulation or digital services market creators who might need to sit at the policy level now, but be agile in their thinking. These policies should be broken down into micro problems which make life easier for citizens and will be available, affordable to as many people as possible. So it can be done. I have faith in that.
Okay. In terms of kind of the way we access digital technology, when we were born and we were kind of growing up, the technologies around the world existed. We weren't limited to technology in Sri Lanka. We were exposed to the entire world. And as a consumer of tech, we know that the world has moved on significantly further ahead than us. When we interface with government technologies, platforms, whether you're going through the visa system to go into a country or whether you are trying to renew your license, it's unfortunately a painful experience. One of the ways that onboarding happens drastically is by ensuring that the user experience that people have is quite a beautiful one. It's tricky because you can't really put it in an RFP and say, make UX good, because it's such a nuanced subject. And unfortunately, I feel like the decision makers on the other side don't really, I wouldn't say they don't care, but I don't think they understand the subject well enough to say what is good and not. So we as kind of an industry and a government are kind of always being segregated because the consumers that are being onboarded to the digital economy are not being onboarded to the Sri Lankan economy. They are being onboarded globally. They create their Facebook accounts. They use the Ubers and the Pick-me's. But once they kind of interact with the government infrastructure, it's decades behind. And no one seems to care. It's at least the viewpoint that we have, because we've seen the same set of infrastructure not change for the last 20 years. What's your view on that, and do you see that changing over the next coming years?
I think the change has to be fundamental. I spoke about APIs, I spoke about open. Let me first say that this problem, I used to ingest. I promise it's ingest, so don't throw bottles at me. It's a CIO problem. The CIOs, IT organizations, whether they be in the private sector or in the public sector, traditionally want to build things and they want to own things, just like engineers do, and I'm an engineer. The concept of defining success not in line with how much you have built, but how much innovation you have enabled by opening the little or minimalistic platforming investments you have done and allowed others to develop on top of it and create an open market for competition on the service arena. That thinking is the change required. I believe in Sri Lanka, the private sector has moved somewhat, but there's a long way to go even in the private sector. The public sector needs to really rethink on IT, that IT needs to be minimalistic. Platforms, ideally across government. Isolated platforms, a few isolated platforms per industry, all connected via, for example, the National Data Exchange. Beyond that, exposure, safe exposure of APIs, safe exposure of capability, so that the developer community, local and global, can put these elements together to create solutions. And I think that's the change in mind and mindset that we require.
So I'll talk a little bit about the API problem in through a bit of personal experience. We launched a company called Simple Books like 10 years ago. And then the idea for us was to ensure that incorporating a business is a pretty streamlined, easy idea. And as you know, Sri Lanka's doing business index is pretty bad. There's a long way to go. The process of setting up a company is a bit of a mess. What we did was we created infrastructure on a front end for consumers where they can log in, they see the business incorporation process step by step. But in reality, what's happening is, though you see a progress bar moving, when you hit submit, someone's running to a printer, printing the documents, going to the registrar of companies, handing something over, signing a piece of paper, coming back. And this entire journey of things moving back and forth, there's probably about 30, 40 people involved. It's one API call. If the API existed, honestly, we shouldn't be in business because that thing can be completely automated. But the automation requires you to rethink the workforce. I would argue that there's probably about 90% of the talent there that is designed, at least at its inception, was designed to help that process, but has now become a hindrance because they are not equipped to all the demand that is coming through. And no number of people will ever be equipped. It is a technology problem. Take, for example, I heard on an interview recently about the CEB meter reading issue, where there's an entire, we have thousands of people on government taxpayer money that are going around reading your electricity bill, which is an automatable task, and it hasn't been done not because of it's not even innovative technology. These are things that were done 20, 50 years ago, and it still works. And then you have things like the journey into Sri Lanka. We have not invested in a smart gate system. I had a couple of my friends flying in recently, and they are stuck in the line for 2 hours, and that's their first impression of Sri Lanka. Installing a smart gate is not expensive. It's very straightforward, and it immediately adds value to the national economy because it improves the experience. It's great for tourism, and the only downside, the single downside it has, is that as things become more efficient, workforce becomes less needed. So you also mentioned that you're looking at a $5 billion growth in the GDP sector, and it's by creating 200,000 jobs in IT. As those jobs are created, you could also argue that you're reducing millions of jobs, and that displacement, in my point of view, is necessary to be able to drive this change. And what we have all come down to as a society is, we are willing to sacrifice the progress of everyone for the protection of a few. And technology is very counterintuitive with that situation. So how do you, solve that problem?
I think you're right. You have hit one of the biggest conundrums, the nail on the head. Hence why I think we need to approach it from a whole of economy perspective. We must do the right thing. Now, there are many pieces running. There's welfare. If we are aspiring to take on the clothing of a developed economy in terms of digital, then our welfare system, our dole system, our retrenchment system, our guaranteed sustenance systems, all need to work in parallel. So if there's an economic dividend out there, how much goes to entrepreneurs? How much goes to restructuring government? It's not a zero-sum game. And therefore, it has to be a whole of economy approach. If you're shifting a workforce, you have to, on one end, retrain or retrench, but create livelihoods, create micro-entrepreneurs out of the same individuals, and hence it's whole of economy. And you're right, if you look at each of these problems in isolation, we won't find the answer exactly there. The answer is somewhere else. So a mixture of peopleization of SOEs, making SOEs efficient, but peopleizing, meaning the employees take ownership rather than employment. These are just concepts which I think go beyond my pay grade. But the concept here is that digital transformation, as well as other forms of transformation that I flashed up there, economic transformation, social and ethical, all these would have fallout. But how do you solve it from a whole of economy perspective?
So I love the frameworks that you've given today around what the future should be, at least on a strategic and a leadership level. But as we know, leadership and the strategy is one part of it. And everyone who builds a startup says this, that it's not really the idea, it's the execution that determines success. So when we look at the implementation of digital transformation of a country, it's something that I'm fond of purely because our business actually does this for a living. We are currently involved in the digital transformation of a few countries in GCC regions. And the engineers that are leading that effort, I would like to argue, are best of class. We recently hired a 25-year-old engineer. He is on a 1.2 or 1.4 million rupee salary, plus. And I think he's brilliant. He will never work for the government because, one, his salary bands will not match. He does not get the recognition that he deserves, and there's just a struggle for him to find his place there. So we have the brightest minds in the country working on solving the digital transformation problems of other regions, while when we look at our own issue, we don't have, we may have the thinking, but on an implementation level, who's actually going to do this? Who's going to build this infrastructure?
I think your friend needs to do it. Question is, how do we create the business model and the engagement mechanism for the government, for you to be able to deal with government and gainfully employ that individual on government work or government-initiated work. So that is the chicken and egg cycle that we have to break. In no means do I think that this is a technology problem. Building the digital economy is not about technology. We have the best technical people in this country. It's about rejigging the economic principles, rejigging the modalities of engagement, creating those value pools which talent will get attracted to. Again, let me draw an example from the telco sector. The fact that the government doesn't cut a check, that the entire industry is private sector led, what does it also do? The government doesn't procure anything. And another big problem in this whole ecosystem, and why individuals far more expert than myself or ourselves, the team working on this, have been experts of much higher caliber who have worked on this problem, who have delivered some great results, but not been able to bring it all together. One key reason is procurement. The absolute mess that is created when government tries to procure anything. Not only mess, waste of time. Now, if the telco sector, the billions of rupees or millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of capex and opex that the telco sector engages in, if those had to be procured by government, we would be still in year 2000. So through that contracting model, that engagement model that the government licensed others to do it, through a framework which is regulated and manages quality of service and other factors, the procurement is done by the private sector. Takes away one big problem. And that is where I know that I may be oversimplifying here. But if all digital services or majority of digital services, platforms, can be converted into managed services models, can be converted into license models, can be converted into PPPs, BOTs, BOOs, then the onus of carrying out the nitty-gritty admin of this digital economy will pass to the private sector, who rightfully have simpler processes for good reason. And in that scenario, I think your company would be gainfully, in that scenario, you might be dealing with a private sector provider to the government. And you would be paid on time and rightfully, and you could then pay your 25-year-old the 1.5 million. Chicken and egg. You have to solve this in pieces to bring everything together.
So opening all of these things up is incredibly challenging, and I understand even though we simplify it on a stage here and say a sentence, the real-world implications and the policies that need to be changed and the laws that need to be amended to do that is quite diverse. Do you think you have the right team to do it?
It's a great start. We have a very committed team at this point in time running the ICTA, a very committed board, all of them volunteers, spending, investing their own time, putting sweat behind this. But clearly, volunteering is not going to be sustainable. We need not 10 people, but we would need hundreds, if not thousands. And that is, again, where my appeal to the private sector, the public sector, and the development sector. I think the development sector is one of those partners who can break a chicken and egg cycle, who can put their commitment and confidence behind a problem which will be solved in the future, leading to sustainability and a recurring cycle of economic growth. So I hope that the development sector, whether they be multilateral or bilateral or donors, that they would see that they would believe in the plan and help to break that initial chicken and egg problem. Because some money needs to go in. Someone has to put money on the table and place a bet that this model will work. And if that bet is placed, and we are all committed, whether we are in the private or public sector, to be prepared to change end to end, then I think there can be success at the end of this cycle.
So before I came here, one thing I did was I kind of put up a post on social media to get people's point of view as to if they had one question to ask, what would that be? The number one, so there's a few themes of those questions, and then one of the main emerging themes was we're talking about innovation, digital transformation, how we're going to do all of these things, but at the same time, for the last 10, 20 years, we still have not been able to build a proper way for payment processing to happen in Sri Lanka. The obvious question that comes up is, PayPal and Stripe and all of these providers. Depending on who you ask, there are different answers to that question. As a user of even the local products for that version, they're not up to the standard that need to exist for global commerce. What's the situation there?
I believe, like I said when I was speaking, that the infrastructure per se, the technology, whether you're looking at slips or SEFT or JustPay, or even the PEN personal exchange name, sort of peer-to-peer payment. Infrastructure-wise, legislation-wise, the payment ecosystem is pretty comprehensive. That's from an initial review. I need to spend more time on it. But I would not pick too many holes in the infrastructure and the capabilities themselves. User experience. Has it been prioritized? I don't think so. End-to-end linkage of the user journeys, whether they be business to business, business to government, government to citizen, citizen to business, etc., have the user journeys being mapped out so that you can apply omni-channel CRM or citizen relationship management platform on the end-to-end process. Again, I don't think so. So the attention needs to be focused on one of those non-tech problems, which is experience, and on inclusion, again, a non-tech problem, and also on ensuring there is adoption, which means change management of citizens. Because the more citizens use it, it gives scale, that will drive innovation and more participation. The question on PayPal and some of the global networks, the invitation, from what I understand, the invitation is out there. There's nothing limiting these players. They are all slightly different. If you take the PayPal model or Stripe or even some of the newer remittance providers, the invitation is out there, but the gap to fill on our end is the trust and governance environment. So while our cybersecurity standards are aspiring to get to those global levels, our governance, our checks and balances, then I believe we can attract these players. And sorry, there's one other important piece, that they will not enter a market which does not demonstrate scale. Therefore, back to your original question, why isn't it being used now? So user experience drives domestic scale, which can attract the global players to come in.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Hans. It's been a pleasure. I think we're out of time. Thank you all for joining, and hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions coming up.
Thank you.